Okay, well, hi, I'm Simon Wallace. I'm one of the committee members of the BCS Consultancy Specialist Group. So, introduction to today's events. It is an introduction for consultants to cloud security by David Poole and Barry Turner, who you probably already spotted while we were setting up a moment or two ago. It's about migrating the IT infrastructure to the cloud and how that changes the threats and vulnerabilities, etc. And it's aimed at the non-technical person to have a deeper understanding of cloud security and to know what questions to ask. I'll tell you briefly about the speakers. David Poole is an experienced cloud and managed services specialist with broad experience in the IT industry, currently holding certifications relating to public cloud, ITIL, and since 2014 he's been focusing on creating and delivering workshops and training designed to help business benefit from the adoption of cloud and managed services. And that's some over 100 engagements. So Barry Turner, 30 years, sales and marketing, working with technology consulting and the print industry in the UK, USA and Europe. He's a AWS solution architect who does ITIL, ISO 27001, the lead order certified project management professional, qualified with specialization on marketing and go-to-market planning. And since 2015, he's worked with 130 cloud MSPs in over 160 engagements. So a couple of deep, wonderful experts who are here today remotely. So we're watching on Zoom, just as the rest of you are out there in the Zoom world. Barry, would you like to share your screen?
So, first of all, thank you for the invitation for David and myself to come along and speak this evening. We had a really good time last time we spoke, which was a couple of years ago. And hopefully you'll see this evening's presentation as an extension of the conversation we had with you in 2020. So the agenda, we'll look at introductions and objectives, the business context for cloud security, the shared responsibility model, the AWS Well-Architected Security Model, cloud vulnerabilities, cloud threats. We'll then compare in a couple of ways cloud and on-prem security. And then finally, we've got 12 questions that you can take away and use when you're talking with your cloud supplier or your cloud system integrator or managed service provider to help you better understand their capability around cloud security. So this is the bit we can skip, as someone's just kindly read that piece out for us. And David, do you want to pick this up and talk about ISSI?
Yeah, so as you realise, we're both independent consultants. We do a lot of work through a company called ISSI, and working with them over the last few years, we have basically helped put together a number of consulting and auditing services which are delivered via the public cloud platform programs. And essentially, that's where we've worked with a lot of partners talking about how their capabilities need to evolve across not just the technology. They tend to be very good from the technology perspective, but the business, the planning, the go-to-market processes that they need to put in place, the ITIL service management, and everything else that they need to put in place to be able to effectively take the quite complex capabilities that the public cloud vendors now offer and to translate those into the services and solutions that the end customers need, and to then help them continue to deliver the best value from that cloud infrastructure. So we've worked with, as the introduction mentioned, we've worked with quite a few different vendors around the world. We've taken those best practices from the public cloud vendors of what they've seen in the market, and they've translated that into a set of requirements that they want to see people using. And we'll talk about specifically security as a part of that as we go forward. So they put together well-architected frameworks and pillars of excellence, and the one we're going to be talking about today is security, but it fits into a much bigger picture. So we've taken those capabilities, and we obviously work looking very closely at the industry research reports out there to essentially gather what the market is seeing. And we put all of those together into education, training, workshops, and methodologies that we can help people accelerate their use of public cloud services. So that's where ISSI fits into the picture. So I'm going to hand you back now to Barry to talk about what we're going to discuss in more detail.
So the objectives for this evening are, first of all, to help you understand the cloud security landscape. We'll look at how cloud security is different from traditional on-prem security, and we'll be able to, our end goal is to enable you to engage in conversation with a potential supplier on how to secure your cloud environment. When we spoke with you a couple of years ago, we sort of finished the presentation with saying, when you're engaged with a cloud supplier, if they're not asking you about security in that very first meeting, they're probably the wrong supplier. So the security conversation around cloud is extremely critical. And the goal for this presentation is to enable you to make that assessment in your own mind when working with what is now an ever-growing pool of potential suppliers. So to set the context, all information security starts with the organization's strategy, scope, and objectives. When sitting down and designing a security strategy for an organization, the very first place you go to is, what is this company doing? What is the scope of the company, and what are they trying to achieve? And aligned to that, you then need to understand the regulatory, organizational, and industry-specific compliance requirements. So a couple of examples: if your organization is a e-commerce retailer with high levels of credit card transactions taking place, then the compliance regulations you need, the compliance requirements and regulatory requirements in place for you are very specific and very detailed. Compare that with a manufacturer where their compliance regulatory requirements will be very different. So that's why understanding the organization and the scope and objectives and the specific demands that places on the organization security is really critical. So we take all that information and from that formulate the information security strategy, policy, and procedures. And so far, these basic steps apply whether it's on-prem security or cloud security. But once we've got the strategy, policy, and procedures in place, the implementation of that security strategy within the cloud is where things start to change. So AWS have this concept of the well-architected framework, and that looks at security, it looks at reliability, performance, operational excellence, and cost management. Much of the content of this slide, this presentation, is focused on the security pillar of the AWS Well-Architected Framework. Well-Architected Framework is a concept that certainly AWS and also Microsoft use, and if you're not familiar with it and you need to engage with cloud, it is a very useful reference document for both of those partners, both of those vendors. So within the AWS Well-Architected Framework, within the security pillar, again, that subdivides into 5 areas. And David will talk about these in more detail as we move on. But they're identity access management, detective controls, infrastructure protection, data protection, and then incident identification and management. And we will come back to those 5 key points time and again as we work through the presentation this evening. And then finally, wrapped around all of that is compliance audit activities. So this is ensuring that your security policies and processes are in place and operating and performing as you would expect them to be. And that might be internal audit, or it might be you need to comply with ISO 27001 or 27701, or some other regulatory body. But audit and understanding that your processes and policies are in place is a core security process. A core concept within the cloud, within cloud security is and just let me get rid of that, is the concept of the shared responsibility model. Now this slide, the diagram on this slide is taken directly from the Cloud Security Alliance website. And the URL is there on the slide. You will find at the end of the presentation, there is 2 pages of references as we've been researching and compiling the presentation, and we've collected all the URLs, and please do use them because there is some really useful material there. So the concept of the shared responsibility model is that security, the responsibility for security is split between the cloud vendor and the cloud user. So the degree of responsibility varies. So if you look at the 3 columns on the right-hand side of the slide, one of them is called on-prem. So in the case of on-prem, the customer with the sort of light blue dots is responsible for all aspects of cloud security. When you move to IaaS, then that responsibility splits, and the lower level, the infrastructure, becomes the responsibility of the cloud provider. And above there, the OS level and above is again the responsibility of the cloud user. And when you move to PaaS, the cloud vendor takes on more responsibility, but again, the customer has to accept that they are responsible for certain elements of the security. The key message here is that you need to be acutely aware of what your responsibility is to make your workload and cloud environment secure, and also what your cloud supplier, what their responsibility is, so that you can put some governance in place and make sure they're delivering. Right, David.
Sure. Yeah. So as Barry mentioned, that was a generic model which is put together by the industry. So as Barry also mentioned, we're using AWS as an example here, but you'll find very much the same, whether it's AWS, Google, Microsoft, or maybe some of the others. But they've all taken this model and applied it to their particular infrastructure. And it then becomes another level of complexity and understanding. So over on the left, we have the infrastructure services, so the IaaS type of services. So this is showing in the orange color. This is what AWS will take responsibility for. So they will essentially build the infrastructure. They'll provide you compute and storage and networking capabilities, and they'll provide the global infrastructure. And everything else is left to the customer, as we've just seen. As you move over to containers, which obviously is another way of delivering services these days, AWS's responsibilities move up. You can see that there's more responsibilities that you would expect AWS to take on. And again, we need to make sure that they're doing that properly. And then again, if we move to more abstracted services, as AWS and the other public cloud vendors launch new capabilities, they're adding more and more capabilities that they are willing to take on as a level of responsibility. Now, the purpose of this slide is not to go into the great details of what all these things mean, but the idea is that, first of all, as Barry mentioned, there's always a customer responsibility, even when the majority of the capabilities are delivered by the public cloud platform. The data is still the responsibility of the customer. And secondly, if you do decide to use a managed service partner to help deliver this, then a question can be, well, where do you fit in as a supplier? So you're getting these capabilities from the public cloud platforms. I'm expected to deliver something and manage and own and maintain part of it as a customer. So as a managed service provider, which parts of these are you going to essentially take over ownership, and how are you going to provide me the visibility of how that's working and provide the information that I need about that? So it actually becomes a three-way model with the public cloud vendor, the supplier of the services, and then still a requirement for customers to own probably the data and to some level the applications. So there will always be at least a two-way split between responsibilities, and maybe three if you're using a supplier as well, a partner. So it's a moving target. It depends on as the cloud services evolve, as your requirements evolve. So, but it's something you need to be aware of and to be able to have discussions and understand where is your responsibility and what can you expect from the public cloud vendor and from your managed service supplier if you choose to use one. So that's different models and as they've applied. So we're going to move on now into going into a little bit more detail about the different architectural frameworks for security. Now, as Barry mentioned, there are 5 main topics, which we've already listed. They come under different categories. So there's directive, so setting up how you want things to run. There's the protection and prevention. You also detective to find out what's happening in your environment, and then obviously you want to respond to that as quickly and efficiently as possible. So we have the 5 core security topics, which we're going to spend more time on during this presentation to talk about where they fit and what sort of questions you should be asking yourselves, asking your customers, and asking your managed service supplier. In addition to those, which we're not going to go into great level of detail, there are also additional areas to be thinking about. So security is in a level with using public cloud, a lot more automation is happening. You can configure what's called infrastructure as code. So you essentially set up a script that will just automatically set you up a new environment, the new workloads. And if you do that, you really need to make sure that what you're automatically deploying is as secure as possible and meeting all of your policies and procedures and governance that you've set in place. So thinking about shifting left, as it's referred to in the DevOps cycle, and integrating security into your DevOps development pipelines. There's an opportunity with all of the tools we're going to talk about to, instead of thinking occasionally once a year, once a quarter, to try and find out if your environment is compliant to whatever policies or frameworks you have in place, you can automate that process, continuously monitor what's happening in the environment, and also automate your response if necessary. There's a level of resilience aspect to security. So a better design of your solution, minimizing your attack zones, using the capabilities of the network infrastructure, which we'll talk about, can minimize the effect and impact of a security issue, a security incident. And you've also got, obviously we have whatever you're using. So if you're using particular servers, Windows have their own patch management process. You need to be able to make sure you're keeping up to date with all of that. And as we're seeing in the market, there's definitely, and we'll see here today, there's a lot of data, a lot of analytics, a lot of data being generated, which if you use the right tools, you can apply some artificial intelligence and learning to what's going on and really understand what's happening in your environment. So those are the 5 areas we're going to go into at the top in more detail. So let's dive in with identity and access management then. So what you want to be thinking about is centralizing your access management approach. Ideally, you have a single dashboard where you can easily onboard and offboard people into your systems, provide them the appropriate access at whatever levels, depending on their role, and apply those not at the individual level, but apply them at a role-based level. So essentially, if somebody is a DevOps engineer, they go into a certain group, and any policies which apply to DevOps engineers will be automatically applied to that person. And if that person leaves or shouldn't have access to a particular customer anymore, it should be very easy to remove that very quickly, and also to be able to prove you've done that, because that's obviously very important sometimes for audits. So most people are using Active Directory in some way, shape or form. There's usually an integration in with there somewhere along the line. And there's extensive identity and access management for just authenticating people onto a system, often with single sign-on, often with MFA, to make sure that you do have the right people getting access to the right systems. And ideally, if you put together a system approach, then you can avoid what we might call credential fatigue, where people have to continuously log in and log out and change environments that they're working in and changing their login profile so that they get the appropriate access. So if you do a good job there, you can make it as seamless as possible. It's very important to look to have policies to only give people access to the capabilities that they should have access to. I've seen customers get themselves into trouble where people have access to things that they shouldn't have, given admin rights when they shouldn't, and it's caused problems. So you want to be thinking about, when you define those roles, define what rights to what resources in what regions or areas you want them to have, and only give them that access. And have an escalation process in place if they need to elevate their privileges for a temporary basis. And you need to be thinking about this, not just about people, but you also need to be thinking about processes and virtual machines, because a lot of this is now automated. It's driven by the APIs. So as you have systems accessing your cloud environment, they will be accessing in with API. They need to have credentials. They need to have key management, and all of that needs to be considered of how that's managed. And again, the public cloud providers like AWS will provide a key management service for you to make that process as easy as possible, but they'll also integrate in with existing key management processes that you might have already in place. And then finally, you want to make sure that you have effective logging, so you can make sure you know who's accessed what, where, and when. So collecting all of the information about everything that happens in the cloud environment, and passing that information to a secure area where it can't be tampered with, and then using that information, as we'll see, to monitor what's going on and define what normal behavior looks like, or use tools to actually help define that through the application of machine learning, and then follow up on anything that's a deviation. So if somebody suddenly, a user ID is logging in from the Far East, when you know they're based in the UK, that's a deviation. So having tools that can automatically help you with that capability can really put a step up in terms of your security stance within the public cloud environment. So moving on from that, looking at the usage policy in a little bit more detail, we have thinking about what your policies should be doing. So the key thing is to thinking about enabling capabilities rather than denying capabilities. You want the users to be able to do their job as easily and as transparently as possible. You want them to be able to find the rules which they are going to have to adhere to. They should be easy to understand. They should be clearly defined. Hopefully, it depends on the company you're working with. Hopefully, they have some kind of cloud center of excellence. They should be defining these things. They should be publishing them and making them clear and available to the end users, to the whoever they happen to be, developers, security people, IT, applications owners, etc. So all of those applications and working out what you need to do and how you get privilege and what it allows you to do should be clear. And ideally, like I say, you want to avoid losing some of the benefits of cloud, the ability for people to go in and fire up resources on demand, to change the requirements if they need temporarily more access or they want to downgrade and turn things off at the weekends. You want to be able to make sure that you're not losing by putting so much security control in place. You're losing a lot of benefits from the cloud, from the agility, the flexibility that it can offer. And don't just think about the people. Think about the machines. Think about the applications. If you're running a hybrid environment, you can have applications calling on resources in the cloud from a data center. What does that look like? You have remote users, etc. So you want to be thinking about how the applications work in this environment as well. And as I mentioned, if you can centralize that and have a clear vision of view of what's happening from an identity perspective, it gives you a much clearer understanding of what's going on in your environment. So the point is, if the correct way is the easiest way, then you have the best chances to actually make that happen. So that's a quick overview of identity and access management. So I'm going to pass you back to Barry to talk about the detection, which is the next part of the pillar.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to start on the right-hand side of the slide with one of my hobby horses. So tagging is a core activity when you're designing a cloud environment, making sure everything and everyone is tagged, because once it's tagged, the person is tagged, the process is tagged, then all activity becomes much easier to trace. We've got on here on this slide a number of the AWS services that are used to help the detection process. So CloudTrail records every single API call and the details of that call. Every activity once you touch a keyboard is recorded. Config is a service whereby it manages the configuration management, looks for changes, and can be set up to monitor changes at a service level and alert when changes are made. Guard duty is their threat detection. So guard duty is monitoring the services and infrastructure and looking for any malicious activity or someone trying to do something that they shouldn't be doing. And then Security Hub is the security management piece where you start to manage the incident. Now, whilst we've used the AWS examples here, I could write the same slide for Microsoft and for Google and for Oracle. All of the main vendors have services and products. Just let me get rid of this, that provide you with a very comprehensive set of logging and recording activities, logging and recording capabilities. So when designing your cloud landing zone, please take into account these services from day one and have a clear vision in terms of how you are going to not only capture all the activity, secondly, you need to understand where you're going to store it, And the recommendation, the best practice, is that you store it away from the main workloads in a separate account or a separate subscription, and have that tightly locked down with minimum access to it. And then use some form of log analytics to be application to be able to understand what's going on, visualize the activity, and identify that malicious behavior, or malicious or unusual behavior. So we're now going to look at infrastructure protection, which is the third of the 5 pillars of the security pillars that we talked about. And there are 4 aspects to infrastructure protection. The first is the network. And really the network isn't that different to the network within a data center. It's just that it's sat in the cloud and it's software configurable. So within the network, the key elements to think about are network design, in which subnet isolation is critical, and use of hub and spoke designs to make sure that different workloads, different business practices are all sat in different areas and only talk to one another as required. The second aspect is access management. And this links heavily with the identity and access that David was talking about. So let me get rid of this. So making sure that the only people and processes that can enter your network are those that you want to be there. And we do this with, amongst other things, network security groups, firewalls, and bastion hosts or jump boxes. All of the vendors have a range of these services, either built into the core services, so that the network, or as additional services that you layer on. And then the third area is external connectivity. So, and we'll touch on this again when we look at data protection. So external connectivity, the cloud is distant from your organization. You do need to connect to it, and it needs to be done in a secure way. And there are 3 areas to think about here. The first one is either VPN or some form of direct connection. The second is the use of content distribution networking. CDN is a core component of many cloud workload architectures, and again needs to be considered as part of your network and secured. And then finally peering, where you need to work with other either cloud vendors or other networks within your own chosen vendor. So the second area of infrastructure protection is virtual machines. And this is very, very similar to on-prem machines. And here we need to look at hardening. It might be a basic standard you have internally. It might be you use one of the CIS standards, and which is something we see applied really commonly in the work that David and I do on a day-to-day basis. Think about endpoint protection. Again, access management, and you'll see access management coming up time and again, which is why it's always the first of the pillars that we talk about. And then finally, compliance management. So if your organization has standards that you apply in terms of the hardening and the endpoint protection and access management, compliance management ensures that you know the standards are being applied and adhered to. And as David mentioned, a lot of the compliance management can now be done automatically, so that you do know real time that your workloads and cloud environments are compliant with your policies. The third area are systems. and in here we've got the monitoring and reporting, identity and access management, key management that David talked about. Key management is a critical component of infrastructure management. If one of your engineers needs to log on to a Linux server, so he logs on to a Bastion host, he will almost certainly require keys. If you've got API access into your workloads, again, some form of key management will be required. Tagging and logging, we talked about already fairly to some length, and compliance management, and finally policy management. So all of the vendors provide you with extensive ability to design and deploy policies in an automated way, and it's a really effective tool that we see used in some fairly imaginative ways, but effective ways to make sure that that the infrastructure is secure. And finally, the last aspect is process, right? And this is one of the key areas where cloud security is quite different from on-prem. The ability to automate your deployment is critical. So being able to deploy templates, whether they're runbooks that you've developed yourself, whether they're using one of the applications such as Terraform, but ensuring that you can, every time you deploy infrastructure, it's done in an automated manner, and that changes are again done in an automated manner, reduces your security risk because you ensure that the infrastructure that you're deploying is compliant with your policies. And again, patching and patching is the second area under process. Critical at both the VM level and application level, and all of the vendors provide you with an array of tools that enable you to do organized patching on an automated way, and then report on whether that patching's been done.
Yeah. Before you move on, Barry, there looks like there's an awful lot on here to cover, and there is a lot of things to think about. So what the vendors have also done, probably slightly more recently, is they've created what's called a concept of a landing zone, where essentially they've taken all the best practices that they've seen around things like hub and spoke architectures, secure access, identity and access management and roles, and put those into standard scripted deployable configurations. So you as a customer or a managed service partner can take those as a starting point and deploy those, and you know that every time you deploy a new environment, a new system, that it's meeting those best practices that AWS in this case thinks is the best way of running it, plus whatever the managed service provider has learnt. So they can automate, using the automation that Barry just mentioned, automate a lot of this so that you know that whatever you do is meeting those best practices. So hence, they're trying to make this as easy as possible, but I think it's an important concept to understand of a landing zone gives you a nice clean environment to deploy virtual machines and other applications into.
Yeah, it does. And I was working with a Swiss managed service provider yesterday that provides services in Azure. And they've taken that concept of automation and landing zone and really worked hard at it. So within Azure, there's a service called Azure Advisor. And Azure Advisor scores your cloud environment on security, reliability, performance, operational excellence, and cost, and gives you a score as a percentage of how ready it is. And this particular Swiss partner, because they're using automated deployment. They're using templates that they've worked on and developed over the past 4 years, and now finding that when they deploy a landing zone for the first time, it's instantly scoring 95% readiness or higher within Azure Advisor. So it's we can't really emphasize enough how the use of these processes is core to you ensuring that your cloud environment is secure.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the aspects of human intervention and the potential problems that can cause later on. So
yeah. So right, this is me again. So data protection. Again, 4 areas in data protection. The first is this is the same whether it's on cloud or whether it's on prem. So data class. Look at your data. This is the start of ensuring you've got appropriate level of policies in place for different types of data. Look at the sensitivity, who needs access to, and how it's being used. So if something is on a public website, that's one level. If it's core company IP or highly confidential, that's obviously got a different degree of sensitivity, much more restricted access and usage by a different type of usage. The second area to think about is encryption, and this is both in transit and at rest, and this is where the 5 pillars, it demonstrates the 5 pillars are really quite interwoven, because the encryption in transit is all done within the network management area, and that's typically done using either TLS, where you're working across the internet, or a VPN. And encryption at rest used to be a real problem. With most of the cloud providers, encryption at rest can become quite easy for you to implement and manage. And it can be applied to object storage, file storage, block storage, and databases. You do need to think about your certificate management. So most of the vendors enable you to do that, and they will manage the certificates and make it easy for you. But there are certain organizations who require that the encryption is done and they retain the control of the certificates. So again, that can be implemented across the cloud. The third area is systems and process, and you'll see that this systems and process piece comes up repeatedly because it's so critical in terms of you implementing security. And here under data classification, again, under data protection, we've got identity and access management. So understanding who needs to access which type of data, how long they need to access it for, and work with it is a core component of, and it's an output from your IAM strategy and also your data classification. Making sure your tagging is in place, that your policies are there, using lifecycle management. So all of the cloud vendors with when you're using their object storage, enable you to implement lifecycle management, which means you can treat different pieces of data in different ways. Some you need to store for long term and archive, others you can dispose of after fairly short periods. So lifecycle management is a critical way. Automation, again, this is one of the hobby horses you'll hear that David and myself talk about time and again. Lots of this stuff can be automated to make your life easier and more efficient, and also to make it more secure. And then finally, monitoring and alerting. So if someone is trying to access data and they shouldn't be, you really need to know about it. And again, finally, with compliance, making sure that you've got compliance management in place to understand that your policies are being adhered to. And then finally, the final aspect of data protection is data backup and recovery. And here, the scheduling can be done in an automated manner. So again, I was working with a second client yesterday, and we were looking at in some detail at their backup, and they were using in the cases we were looking at, they were using this was an Azure client, so they were using Azure backup services to do the initial backup, and then they were also taking a snapshot as well, so that they made sure that they had the data well in a secure manner and recoverable. And then the other things to think about are archiving for that data that you need to put away for a long time, and cross-region replication. So all of the cloud providers build their infrastructure in regions, and within regions you have different availability zones. Regions are completely separate environments, but you can you can store data across regions to give you a much higher level of security around that data. It's not cheap, it's not recommended for everyone, but if you've got data that's highly critical to the organization, it's an option that's easy to implement in cloud, albeit it does have some downsides around the cost. And then data classification, we've sort of talked through. Data classification is the starting point for your security, implementing security and understanding which pieces of who you give access to, how it's being used, and the types of security that you will apply. So some of those examples are in the bottom of the slide. So and server-side encryption must be active, as we talked about earlier. That can be a relatively easy process to implement in the cloud. MFA authentication required before deletion. So if you've got critical pieces of data, then if someone tries to delete it, they need to put some form of multi-factor authentication in place before the deletion can go ahead. Bucket versioning is again gives you enables you to use make sure you're keeping different versions of the data in the bucket, and bucket redundancy. Storage must not be used. I'll pass on that one. I don't quite understand that.
So what's that, the reduced redundancy storage?
Yeah.
Basically, reduced redundancy storage has the normal default S3 has like 11 nines of availability, which is very difficult to replicate in your normal environment. If that cost is prohibitive to you, you can do a reduced redundancy storage where it's might be 5 nines or 3 nines.
Right.
But essentially, if this is your critical high availability data, you don't want to be using that. So you want to turn off or have a policy that says you cannot put this type of data into reduced redundancy storage.
Right. Thank you for rescuing me there, David.
Yeah, no problem. And there is a question actually from somebody about what about data in use? I don't know if you want to tackle that or you want me to tackle that one.
Do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. So to my mind, and I'd be interested in anybody else's opinion, but data in use is really about data that's obviously actively being worked on by a user. So it's kind of in the computer and it's being used. That tends to be, if you think about that shared responsibility model, that tends to be outside of responsibility of the cloud, because it's running in some kind of environment that you're actively working on that data. And when you store it back in, then that becomes, again, part of the sort of availability of S3, etc. So I think we don't really come across that data in use term, to be honest. But I think that's probably why. It's more about you've moved data into a computer, it's being worked on, and then when it goes back into the memory, goes back into the file storage or whatever format, then it again comes back to the responsibility of the cloud vendor.
Yeah. Thank you, David.
Oh, my turn to talk as well.
Your turn, yeah.
Right, thanks, Barry. So we've covered 4 of the pillars, so we're getting there. So thanks for your patience. We're now moving on to incident management, which is obviously a key important area to focus on. So traditionally, security has been a little bit of a dark art with a separate group who really kind of understand security to a very detailed level, might not necessarily be involved in the sort of day-to-day activities. But hopefully what you've seen over the last few slides is that if you think about automating processes, you need to be thinking about making sure security is a part of that automation. So it needs to be integrated in. If you've got a lot of these security tools, which the public cloud vendors provide, and others, there are lots of third-party tools as well that can do some very good things around security. You integrate those into your day-to-day operations. So what we see as a model kind of evolving is you have your traditional network operations or service management center. They have all of their usual incident management, ITIL-based incident problem, change management focus, etc. But in addition, they gain some responsibilities around security. So what we want to do is make sure that the security experts residing in the Security Operations Center provide playbooks to explain what happens in certain incidents, and they know how to react to that. We've talked about using security services to do baseline monitoring and patching to keep everything up to date, to monitor what's happening, and to implement best policies and best practices. So those are things that can be done day to day by the network operations team according to structured playbooks and processes which are provided to them. And then they may be using some of the tools and some of the outputs from the public cloud environment to monitor what's going on with the customer. So they may only have read-only access, for example, but they can see some of these log alerts. They can see what's happening. They can get the alerts coming in. We can also apply some intelligence to those alerts and events as they come in, so that only the key things are actually surfaced to the network operations team. But they can monitor on a day-to-day basis, be able to monitor, see what happens, and be able to react to that. And hopefully there's a level of automation to that reaction as well. So there's definitely a place for the traditional service desk to implement the current controls, to make sure that the services are deployed. So, for example, you might have a cloud management portal which is available. It could be developed by the IT organization internally. It could be something that's delivered by a partner, but you have a self-service catalog. Some of those might be things like downloading new applications, applying patches, doing some of that antivirus and endpoint protection you talked about. And they may be services that are offered, and users may have a self-service capability. And all of that day-to-day responsibility should be in the responsibility of the general service desk. But they should also have a clear communication and the structure and an escalation path to the experts residing either next door to them or wherever, who are the security experts. And these are the guys who should have the cloud security certifications, who really understand all the tools and technologies that both the public cloud vendors and the third-party tools that have been selected by the customer or by the partner, how they work and how they can operate and how they can really make sure that security is top and center of everything that happens. So their responsibilities may be things like escalation of incidents. So if something comes along which is outside of the normal behavior, it can be escalated from the service desk, and it becomes something that the Security Operations Center focuses on, resolves it, and then hopefully, if possible, automate a response to it and drive that back down to standard workloads. You can also do a lot of environment and workload scanning. So not just that is your VMs up or who's accessing what the parts of the environment, but you can use security tools to scan the workloads and see if there's any vulnerabilities. You can scan the environment and see if anybody has left a hole in the firewall open. And you can do this automatically on a continuous basis with the tools that are provided. So how do you use those and how do you make the most effective use of it should be something that the Security Center should understand. And we've mentioned a few times using these capabilities to ensure that your environment stays continuously compliant to whatever governance, benchmarking, best practices, regulations that you have that you need to meet, that you can use these capabilities to ensure that you remain compliant to all of these things. So if somebody tries to create a resource which doesn't have the appropriate tag, so it can't be charged for appropriately, you can flag that and you can choose to do something about it. I've seen partners with the customers' requests automatically shut down resources which people have tried to create if they don't have the appropriate tags which say, what is this resource being used for? What's the project? What's the account? What type of profile? Is it development or is it production or is it testing? And if you don't put the right tags in there, it won't stay up. So you can be that strict, but at the very least you can have a compliance and around your tagging to say everything that is deployed in the environment should be deployed against a particular cost center so you know how much to charge. So there's lots of opportunities to work on that. So making that, thinking about what that should look like, implementing those processes and making sure that they're complied to is something that their security specialists can focus on. And as we talked about, deploying everything using infrastructure as code. So what this means is that everything in the cloud is essentially software derived. You can create a script that basically, as I was talking about the landing zones, you can automatically deploy something into the cloud environment, like a new VM or an entire new environment through templates of infrastructure as code. So those templates have an aspect of networking, they have an aspect of tagging, they have an aspect of all the various components that go together. So somebody needs to make sure that whatever gets developed and defined is adhering to those security best practices. So a level of governance over those scripts which are collected and put together in the library for repeat deployments. Triage of incidents. So as an incident comes to the SOC, they want to be able to hopefully resolve it. They may need to bring in the public cloud vendor or a partner. They might be using a Palo Alto firewall or whatever it happens to be. So it might need to bring in different partners to resolve issues and to also understand what's happening from the bigger security threat landscape and using that to inform all the processes and governance they put in place. Keeping up to date with the latest, for example, CIS benchmarking, as Barry mentioned, we see that a lot. And then often see partners, if they're developing and delivering services to customers, they often develop very specific security services, endpoint protection services, antivirus services, DDoS protection, etc. So they may well have some dedicated services which can be sold and delivered to the end user. And again, it could be an internal IT organization thinking about how you want to deliver specific services which people can use and basically sort of self-service to via a cloud portal. Somebody needs to think about what all that needs to look like and keep that up to date. So that's a logical home is the security center. So essentially it's there to manage anomalies, manage escalations and manage the critical responses.
David, I'm conscious of time, so
yeah.
I suggest, yeah.
So I think we should just leave in the interest of time. These two slides are really kind of, the last slide is kind of just talking about how the various components, and again, depending which cloud vendor you're talking about, there'll be different ones, but they will all have different components for those different levels.
Yep.
So you need to understand how all of those things go together. And then what they're also doing is taking all of these capabilities, and again, there's a few more in here, looking at different aspects of security. And also you can integrate solutions from third parties via the partner network. And Security Hub will collect information from all of these different systems, aggregate them, prioritize them, and then apply some intelligence to look for emerging trends or potential issues. And that AWS Security Hub gives you that single dashboard view of what are high priority security alerts and what your security posture looks like. And all of that gives you the ability to automate your security checks and be able to take action swiftly. And that gives you the underlying platform to be able to do things like conducting those automated security checks based on, is your current environment compliant to CIS best practices or AWS best practices or Azure's advisor best practices, etc. It also allows you to integrate other systems and automate workflows. So if you know what your reaction should be in a certain circumstance, then you can create a script and automate that process. So rather than waiting for somebody to react to a security incident, you can automate it away. And you can take there's a lot of information, a lot of moving parts here. So having tools which have the intelligence to correlate all the findings across all of these different tools can deliver really interesting insights as to what's happening into your environment and surface security issues which you may otherwise not get to see at all. So pass it back to Baron.
Yeah. So thank you, David. So this slide looks at cloud vulnerabilities. I did try to sort of make it a bit less of an eyeful. So if we look in the left-hand column, and I'll just talk briefly down here, because you're very welcome to have a copy of the slides. So, and this is where cloud security starts to vary drastically from on-prem, in that these vulnerabilities are, many of them are very specific to cloud. So the first one is poor access control. This is why identity and access management is so critical. And we've got a slide later on about the most common issues, and you'll see that come up time and again. Misconfiguration vulnerabilities. So it's so easy to change stuff in the cloud. It's a few strokes on the keyboard and your data is open to the world, and misconfiguration figures very high in terms of the attacks that are reported. Shared tenancy vulnerabilities, for most organizations, that's probably not something that you need to consider. And this refers to the fact that you are on a shared infrastructure. Other organizations are using the infrastructure, and there is a vulnerability there. And some organizations are acutely conscious of that, there are ways of managing that. So supply chain vulnerability. So this is where an attack comes in via one of the vendors you work in. That could be the cloud vendor, and although their approach to security is very robust, more likely it's one of the applications that you're working with. So the recent one that was really high profile was SolarWinds. SolarWinds is an application used by lots of managed service providers to manage their customers' resources. Hackers hacked into the SolarWinds software. An update was released into, I think it was several thousand MSPs globally, and suddenly the hackers had access to that. the way you manage supply chain vulnerability is by making sure that you've clearly vet suppliers before working with them. Another key one is the attack vector change. If everything is locked down in your on-prem data center, it's relatively straightforward. As soon as you move stuff to the cloud, extensive use of APIs, the complexity of the architecture, the dynamic changes going on within the architecture, exposure to the internet, all of that dramatically increases the attack vector, which is why the approach to cloud security needs to be so different. The process. Right, so failure to adapt processes for public cloud will create security vulnerabilities. Simply moving your on-prem security into your cloud environment will leave you vulnerable. Lack of visibility comes when you use standard tools you've been using in your on-prem for established tools you've got in on-prem that aren't cloud specific. When you move into the cloud, you really, the best practice is to use cloud specific tools. And then lack of cloud security strategy and architecture. So you need to start with this brings us back to the start of the presentation, when we looked at the gathering the business and security requirements before implementing and designing your cloud security strategy. That you need to have that done as from day one, and security built in from day one, designed in from day one, into your architecture strategy, your security strategy. If it isn't, there will be gaps. I also researched cloud threats, and actually these threats are generic. There are very few threats of the external issues, and actually most of these apply to on-prem or cloud. It's the vulnerabilities we looked at here that you need to be acutely aware of. David.
Okay, yeah. So we talked about a lot of different things that can go wrong, but what are the typical incidents that are most common? This is from a recent Checkpoint cybersecurity report. As I mentioned, 23%, so a quarter is wrongly configured resources or accounts, so human intervention. So coming back to automation, best practices, templates, can avoid those. Managing your data and deciding who's allowed to have access to those is the next one along. Not managing your accounts properly and compromising and not having the right privilege. And then 14% is essentially looking at exploiting vulnerabilities where people have, for example, put in a database but they've left it in a public VPN, and people are constantly automatically looking for vulnerabilities like that, or people putting keys into GitHub libraries. There are tools scanning the systems all the time looking for those things, and as soon as something is there, somebody will get in, they will basically exploit that vulnerability and get out very quickly before you've even noticed. So those are the types of incidents that we typically see happening, which you ought to be thinking about when you think about your cloud security. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is essentially saying, thinking about those different pillars. There's the on-premise on the right-hand side. So this is your traditional approach. You've got Microsoft Active Directory. You've got some SIEM services, some typically physical appliances like firewalls and using sort of endpoint protection, IPS, IDS, etc. And you've got encryption and backup and availability and standard monitoring. Slight changes in cloud in that you have, as you've seen, a different approach and more granular approach to incident and identity and access management, rather. I think you've got a lot more detective controls available. You've got very similar capabilities within security groups and cloud services where they've replicated those capabilities in the cloud. And they've added in some embedded firewalls and other capabilities as well. But where it really kind of changes is the processes. So typically in a traditional IT data center environment, you deploy something, you deploy it for hopefully for as long as possible. There might be some level of automation, but a lot of it is manual. The auditing of what you've got and keeping up to speed and making sure everything's up to date is a highly manual process very often. Whereas within the cloud, it's absolutely designed from day one to be automated, to have automatic compliance, to have infrastructure delivered as code, which means that you can constantly deploy it, kill it, redeploy it, change it, have it running for 10 minutes, having it running for a week, shutting it down, and only paying for what you use. And also thinking about integrating security directly into everything you do. So a number of different requirements there, but probably process is probably the area that we see the biggest change. So I think we probably covered this one.
Yeah, so yeah, let's move on. I'm very conscious of time.
Yeah.
So we put together a list of 12 questions that you can use with your when you're talking with suppliers. So very quickly, at the top one, how many cloud certified security specialists do you employ? All of the vendors have cloud security certifications available, and they're all run to very exacting standards. What security accreditations does your organization hold? What cloud security education and enablement services can your organization provide? If you're new to cloud, that's particularly important. What governance discovery processes do you run? So when you've chosen a vendor, you want to know that they're going to ask you the questions that dig out of you all your governance requirements. How does your organization run in a cloud? How does your organization run a cloud security gap analysis? This is a service that many professional service organizations will provide. Looks at your security strategy and then processes and provide you with feedback in terms of what you need to change. How does your organization utilize the well-architected framework to implement cloud security? Certainly AWS and Microsoft are really strong with their partners in terms of requiring them to use well-architected frameworks, and asking your vendor about their familiarity with it, and will give you a good sense of their competence. David, do you want to take the next
sure.
six?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, as you've seen, a lot of capabilities that the platforms are offering in terms of security monitoring and incident management. So what does the MSP surface to you as the customer? So what portals can you expect? What information can you find out to see how your security stance is currently, and anything that's happened in terms of incidents, how are they handled? So what does all of that look like? A lot of these, the vast majority of these partners are sort of DevOps native, or if not, they quickly adopted DevOps as a way of doing things. So that's the way they like to deploy everything. So how far have they got into deploying security into the DevOps process, and can they help you with your DevOps processes? So there's a lot of security scanning of code as it's developed. So is that something you might need help with? If so, you should be asking questions about that. And then are there specific services like continuous compliance around governance, so that you use an MSP and it can essentially give you, at the touch of a button, it can give you a direct look at exactly how you'll stand in terms of your internal governance or your government regulatory requirements. Are they being met today? And do they have any specific security services? If you want an MSP to help you with your patch management and your endpoint management, and as well as the actual infrastructure itself, or if you've got very critical services you want to give an extra level of security around, you might want to pay for premium capability. So quite often these partners have an enhanced security service that you pay a premium for your critical workloads. So it might be something you're interested in looking out for. And obviously, as we're moving into far more advanced application designs, containers, functions, where things are much more fast moving, much more adaptable, and you might want, again, if you're looking for partners who can help you design those applications, design and manage the container services, Kubernetes, etc. And functions is where you essentially program out and send out a request, and the resources are just fired up for the lifetime of that request. There's a security aspect to all of those things. So as you get into more advanced applications, how much does your partner understand about that, and what can they do for you? And then we talked about the shared responsibility model. So what's the MSP's role in all of those things? So there's 12 questions, which I think if you use those, if you ask your potential partner those questions, if you don't, that will give you a good feel for how much they understand and how much they've implemented in terms of security. Some of them might be more relevant to your particular environment, but hopefully it gives you a good starting point. So, but those are example security questions. So we just look at the kind of the key takeaways from the whole presentation. What we would say is that when you're thinking about cloud, whether it's an MSP or not, if you're thinking about cloud security, look at those 5 pillars and think about each of those aspects and where you fit in and what your responsibility is and what your solution is for those. If you're going to use an MSP, use those 12 questions to really find out what they can do about security and how well they can help you. Hopefully you've seen that security is not only different in the cloud, but also requires a level of security knowledge throughout a lot of the IT organization. So thinking about how you can educate your people and upskill them, and think about security differently, because it is different. If you do it well in the cloud, it can be very secure. If you haven't thought through all of these things, it can be very insecure. So it should be more secure than on premises, but if you don't do it properly, as you can see, if you're not using all those tools in the appropriate way, it can be insecure. So you need to make sure you're doing it well. Use the expertise, find the security certified experts who can really help you with all of these things. Don't have to be an MSP, they can be a cloud security specialist partner if you've got very niche requirements. And as you've seen, there's a lot of cloud specific security tools. So making sure you understand how those all fit together to deliver the overall security environment that you're looking for, and apply all of those in the well-architected framework. So take a look at those. It'll give you a good feel for how the various vendors have looked at security, really thought it through, and provided all of the pillars and capabilities that you need to be able to deliver security securely in the cloud. So that's the end of our slides, I believe.
It is. So there's a bunch of references when you get the slide deck. Yeah.
Didn't have one for you there.
Yep.
We'll put that one in later. That's why the note is there. So yeah. So thank you for listening.
I actually have a question, so I will ask myself. So I come in more frequently with a case where we get involved with cloud with services provided in a cloud manner. But recently we are starting getting in collaboration or in contact with companies that they offer the service not only in the cloud but also in a blockchain. Have you came up across a case where you have to integrate also with blockchains? And if you have come across, have you had any particular thought on how that make it different, as there is not a central authority or central management that you can rely on?
That's certainly outside my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not something we've really come across yet. I would say that certainly AWS has a blockchain specialist group, so they certainly see it as an area of interest. if you think about blockchain, I mean, essentially it's a distributed database. You're going to allow people to, there's going to be some policies about who's allowed to join and who's allowed to make changes to it, etc. So there would be some security policies around who's allowed to kind of join that blockchain and then who's allowed to make changes. And there are different, different levels depending on the blockchain, and there's the ownership of it. So it's not something we've come across too often, I must admit, but I would say it'd be an area where, again, you need to be really thinking about implementing your policies and ensure that those things are implemented, so that if somebody wants to use a blockchain, they need to be a part of.
Yeah, I would suggest there you get some really specialised advice, Antonio.
Thank you. Any other questions online?
From governance and compliance perspective, more in point of view, I was wondering regarding the tracing and especially the logging. Once you actually log every trace anyone does through its keyboard or anything, I do understand how that is a very good, secure way for the company, because you can actually get back to the incident exactly and see what has happened. But have you had moments in which this kind of employee monitoring has been too intrusive or hasn't been, for example, GDPR compliant? Yes, because it doesn't really take into account the intrusiveness that it can have on employees.
So the remember when you're recording the activity within the cloud, you're not recording you're recording the activity of the engineers and people working in the cloud environment. So you're not recording the activities of the general user. So
it's just regarding the data engineers. Okay.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could record all activity. But in terms of the context of what we've been talking about today, it's specifically the activities of people engaged in working on the cloud environment, and also machines and automated processes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah. In terms of securing the data of all the login information, we did touch on this, and that's where we recommend it stored in a separate store that's got very limited access, and is locked down, and the deletion mechanisms using lifecycle rules to protect the data.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Good. Okay, Makia, do we have any last minute questions? Otherwise, we will proceed to close the event. Any last minute question? So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We have some refreshments, sandwiches, and some wine for the people here. Thank you very much, everybody that has joined us. David, Barry, has been an excellent meeting.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. Enjoy your sandwiches and refreshments.
Bye.
Bye.